The Persona 3 remake was pretty disappointing to me. Don't get me wrong, I liked the game well enough, it's just that when compared to the original, I found it to be a major step back in terms of design, presentation, and even mechanically. I was really looking forward to Persona 3 Reload. I was eagerly anticipating how Atlus would update the original for modern audiences. However, what we ended up getting was a version of this classic title that lacks the spark and creative voice that made it so special to begin with. Again, Persona 3 Reload isn't a bad game, but I feel as though it's a bit of a misguided remake. And yeah, that's pretty disappointing to say the least. So in today's video, we're gonna put these two games head to head and analyze them from top to bottom. It's why you came here. But before I begin, I think it's worth it to address the two most common defenses of this remake that people use to completely shut down any of these conversations. Number 1, the original game will always be there, so if you don't like the remake, then just play the old game. This line of thinking has always come off as a flimsy way to dismiss potential criticism. By that logic, Atlus could have done anything with the remake and you wouldn't be allowed to critique it. It's not even as if the original is easy to get a hold of anyways. This isn't even like a Final Fantasy VII remake scenario, where if you don't like the new direction, the PS1 game is just readily available. Have you seen the prices of some of these games? Number 2, you're just blinded by nostalgia. You only dislike parts of this game because it's different, not worse. I first played the original Persona 3 all the way back in 2014, not too long after I finished Persona 4. Believe it or not, I wasn't too hot in the game at the time. In fact, one of the first videos I made on this channel was a deep dive into my feelings on Persona 3. In case you need a reminder, I was fairly critical towards the game, and was very vocal about certain quirks I wasn't a fan of. However, over the years since then, I've replayed the game quite a few times, and my outlook has changed significantly. Aspects of Persona 3 that I originally saw as blemishes morphed into something a lot more positive. The unique quirks introduced and featured exclusively in Persona 3 lends this game a certain flavor that you can't find anywhere else in this franchise. Not to everyone's taste, but it's impossible to deny certain factors play a massive part in carving out Persona 3's core identity. Nostalgia has never been a deciding factor for me in any of my videos. Sure, sometimes I'll look at something from my younger years and will even reminisce on those memories, but I always make sure to put those innate biases aside and give my honest thoughts through my current lens. Boiling down the critics of Persona 3 Reload to these nostalgia-blind fanboys of the original is just plain dishonest, especially when some of these critiques have plenty of merit if you're actually willing to hear them out. Of course, you don't have to agree with everything I'm about to say, nor am I trying to insinuate that I have some sort of authority of how you should feel about this game. If you played Persona 3 Reload and had a great time with it, then I'm happy for you. I hope you continue to enjoy it. But for me, this remake missed the mark in a lot of areas, and fails to recapture the spark of the classic title it shares a name with. But first, a little context as to how we ended up here. So picture this. You're a struggling game studio in the mid-2000s and you just released your magnum opus JRPG. It's packed to the brim with high-budget cinematics, plenty of voice acting, and there's so much game here that it needs to be sold on 2 entire PS2 discs. God damn. Sounds like a recipe for success. Too bad nobody bought it. Yes, for as ambitious as Atlus's Digital Devil Saga was on paper, the overall niche nature of the project all but secured the game was never gonna make it anywhere beyond cult classic status. The PlayStation 2 generation was pretty rough for Atlus. In a time when the cost of development was increasing and the competition was ramping up, the company struggled to find any real success financially. While this era is well regarded in terms of quality, it doesn't make up for the fact that none of their games were reaching the necessary numbers to continue their investment. So yeah, things weren't looking pretty great for Atlus at the time. And by knowing this, it becomes easier to understand why Persona 3 ended up the way it was. Persona 3 is a game born from limitations, and with compromises comes creativity. When you don't have the biggest budget in the world, you need to get smart with how you allocate your resources. This is why the calendar system in Tartarus were such an effective idea from a development standpoint. It allowed for a smart reuse of environments, so that time could be spent on other aspects of the game. Social links exist not only as a method of providing the player with a constant stream of new content, but also as a way to demonstrate the game's main themes. It's almost poetic in a way that, in the time where the company was suffering the most and was on the verge of closure, Atlus made a game about appreciating the time we have left while we've still got it. The inevitability of death shouldn't be something to be feared. Rather, it's the ultimate motivator to live your life to the fullest. finding a reason for living and developing a strong enough conviction to never back down, even in the darkest of times. That reason for living can come from anywhere, whether that be from the bonds you share with those around you, the loss of a loved one, or even the act of preserving someone else's memory. Persona 3 has a deeply profound message that resonates closely with a lot of players, but the success of this game doesn't end there either. This game is packed to the brim with design choices that serve to reinvent the Persona franchise for a new era. It's got the sauce, if you will. The massive success of Persona 3 revitalized interest in the series after a long hiatus, and it's safe to say we all know the story from there. Persona has basically defined modern Atlus at this point, and a lot of that success stems from how much of an impact Persona 3 left when it came out. This game has been used as the basic framework for the series going forward, and while each subsequent title has attempted to innovate on that formula, there are some unique features still exclusive to this game that give it a sense of identity. Hell, compare this game to Persona 5, and while you can see glimpses of the familiar, at their core, they hold very different gameplay and narrative philosophies. And this is when the conversation about a potential remake sparked within the community. Let's not beat around the bush here. Persona 3 is a game from 2006. It's a little crusty around the edges, and doesn't offer the same amount of quality of life features that are in some of Atlus's latest games. If you're a newcomer to the series, or just don't have much experience with the genre in general, Persona 3 might be a little hard to get into, and I can imagine that being a little frustrating. While I can understand where they're coming from, I was never on board with the idea that this game needed a remake. To me, Persona 3 is a game deeply intertwined with the time frame it was released in, not just in terms of the aesthetic design, but also in terms of gameplay mechanics. The stuff that makes Persona 3 what it is stems from Atlus's situation when it came out, and by remaking the game from the ground up in 2024 vision, it runs the risk of potentially dampening that original voice. Not to say that those mechanics and designs can't be updated in a way that stays true to the original vision, but it's a slippery slope, especially when most of the original creatives aren't involved with the project. If you've been watching my videos for a bit now, then you might have noticed that I put a lot of emphasis on the idea of identity and legacy. I'm very passionate about this topic. I want creatives to be remembered for the hard work they put into their projects and the stories that they attempt to tell. It's why I put in the effort to showcase games in the context of when they were originally released, and why I'm not exactly the biggest fan of the whole enhanced re-release shtick. Not to say that there aren't good ways of doing it, but most of the time, mainly from Atlus, it's not handled all too well. There's usually a bunch of quality of life improvements, new story content that doesn't mesh well with the classic game, and altered visuals that go against the intended mood. I wouldn't have too much of a problem with this if these newer versions were just alternate ways of experiencing these games, but the issue is that Atlus usually treats them as the new default, regardless if the final product was worse or not. But that's not to say that I'm fully against the idea of games getting remakes at all, because there are good ways to do it. I'm personally more of a fan of when remakes try to do their own thing while being respectful to the original. The Resident Evil games come to mind when I think of this. They aren't attempting to invalidate the classic experience, rather they take the original idea and apply it in a different context. These two games stand heads and shoulders with each other. Just by looking at footage of both of them, you can find inherent value in eventually trying out both titles. Persona 3 Reload isn't trying to be that kind of remake. Reload strives to be the new definitive way to experience Persona 3, and in some ways, I believe it succeeds in accomplishing that. But in the areas where it counts, it fumbles the bag. Alright, no more dancing around it. Let's just start this shit. In the words of its own developers, Persona 3 Reload strives to be a faithful remake, one that preserves the original vision of the classic title, but with some updates and changes to have it fit in more in line with what players expect out of a game released in 2024. What this means is that Persona 3 Reload has the same core story and structure as the original game. During the daytime, you live your life like a normal high school student. You make friends, join clubs, go on dates, study, the works really. However, once the moon rises up, it's time to jump into action. It's up to you and your friends to suit up and find out the origins behind the Dark Hour and how to permanently rid the world of it. Once every month, a full moon will occur, which signifies the appearance of an extremely dangerous shadow, and with the more of them defeated, the closer the characters get to accomplishing their goals. It's the exact same setup and formula used in the original game, even down to the social links you form and the stats you have to manage. It was a good formula back then, and it's just as good now. Though Reload does add a few bells and whistles into the mix to keep the experience feeling fresh. Persona 3 is a very simple game when compared to the sequels, mostly in regards to the activities available to the player when not dungeon crawling. With over half of your social links being available only during school days and only 2 available at night, then there will be 1 or 2 points in the game where you'll find yourself without much to do. It becomes especially egregious during a max social link run. Winter vacation and the last bit of summer are the most common dry spots, that's for sure. To be fair, the lack of nighttime activities in the original game was in service of another mechanic, but I'll get into that later. The point is, OG P3's social calendar is a bit lacking compared to the later games. I know for a fact that a large portion of players who wanted a remake desired for more to do during the points of downtime. I personally never had that big of an issue with this, but I won't deny the opportunity of new content, even though it's a bit on the minimal side here. We got part-time jobs, alright, that's pretty cool to see. Elizabeth requests are much more encouraged, and you can even take on an unlimited amount at once now. The male party members now have faux social links that range in quality, but I'll be getting into that later. And there's much more to do at Iwatodai Dorm than previously, both by yourself and with your companions. The latter was the one I was really interested in seeing, but was also one of my biggest concerns. Have you ever heard of the saying, "C's doesn't feel like friends"? This is a phrase that's been thrown around a lot, and it's a critique that I never got behind. The members of C's initially start off as cold and distant towards each other. They're more interested in furthering their desires rather than making new friends. Ken is obsessed with avenging his mother. Akihiko dedicates his life in a quest for power thanks to his fear of loss. Mitsuru is racked with guilt because of the Karijo group's experiments, and so on. The members of C's are, at first, self-serving characters, but as the story goes on and the struggles of the party members become more intertwined, they're able to grow closer and develop a genuine bond. This was a very deliberate decision to capture a specific mood. The members of C's aren't like the Phantom Thieves or the investigation team in regards to their camaraderie. Part of me was a little worried that the extra events would trample on that idea too much. However, these are some pretty tasteful activities. You can tend to the rooftop gardens, watch some DVDs, and cook some meals. The most extravagant these events get are the group study sessions available about a week before tests, so you don't have to worry about them Persona 4 goldenifying everything. I like them. A nice bite-sized addition. Something that gives the player a little bit more to do while also exploring the more casual sides of the group. It feels very grounded and realistic, with the appropriate amount of space between the characters being left intact. The only issue I take has less to do with the new activities themselves, rather it's the rewards you get for doing them, and how they have an impact on the game's combat design. And it's here when things started to go downhill for me. So, it's no secret that the original Persona 3 isn't exactly the most beginner-friendly JRPG out there. It may not look like it from an outsider's perspective, but Persona 3 plays very differently from its 2 successors. Personas 4 and 5 have very reactionary combat systems. They're games that put a large emphasis on in-the-moment strategy rather than methodical play. P5 even introduced a mechanic that lets you switch your playable character whenever you exploit a weakness. Persona 3, in comparison, is a much slower game. It has a combat system that asks you to take your time and properly plan ahead before committing to any strategy. Despite the surface level similarities, these are 2 very different styles of turn-based combat when you really break it down, and their unique qualities are even further highlighted when looking at other aspects of the dungeon crawling. Persona 3 stands as the odd one out in the modern trilogy due to its unique approach to the dungeon crawling. While I can understand it not being to everyone's liking, it's undeniable that certain quirks play a very large part in carving out Persona 3's gameplay identity, and were monumental in expressing the ideas at the core of the experience. Persona 3 was the last time the franchise truly emphasized the dungeon crawling. For as much as I like the gameplay of Persona 4 and 5, the systems and design featured in 3 has slowly become more preferable to me over the years. This is probably the closest Persona will ever come to being a roguelike game. The way every piece of equipment comes with its own random bonus effects, how the party versatility allows for unique compositions, and also in the Guardians you have to fight every few floors. All of this plays a massive role in defining what Persona 3 is as an experience. However, I'll be the first to admit that the execution wasn't perfect. There are a few aspects of the original Persona 3's game design that can be a little frustrating, or have some sloppy execution, and in that sense, I agree that a remake could be a good opportunity. You know, polish off some of the blemishes so that the experience can reach its full potential. However, Reload instead opts to change the gameplay in rather significant ways, to the point where the experience is a lot closer to Persona 5 than it is to the game it's trying to remake. Combat in Persona 3 Reload is about what you would expect from the franchise in a post-P5 world. You build a team of 4 party members and exploit weaknesses to score all-out attacks. It's the same framework that's been in place since the original Persona 3, so I won't bore you with the details. Instead, I'll just cover the differences. Brought over from Persona 5 is the baton pass system. Now dubbed shifting, whenever you exploit an enemy's weakness, you're given the opportunity to pass your turn to another party member so you can continue the chain. It was a great system in P5, and it's just as useful here. And it's thankfully a little bit better balanced this time. The bonus effects that were automatically applied in P5 have now been made into passives that need to be equipped on a persona to take effect. Really, this is how it should have been from the start. It rewards you for creating builds around the mechanic, but asks you to give up some valuable skill slots to get the most out of it. However, even this might be a bit too much. Shifting is at its most balanced when all you're allowed to do is pass your turn to another party member, and if the mechanic is going to be featured in the franchise going forward, then it really doesn't need to be anything more than this. Having access to essentially free buffs whenever you pass to another party member is just too much, and it's impossible to balance without making every fight a tedious chore to get through. Some other new features to this game are the personality traits and theurgies. So this is Atlus's way of trying to further differentiate party members beyond what skills they're rocking. Personality traits are sort of like persona traits from P5R, but now they're limited exclusively to the character itself rather than the persona. Personality traits are unlocked and upgraded through the dorm activities that I mentioned earlier, and trust me, you should make unlocking these your priority. While personality traits range in effectiveness and utility, almost all of them are insanely good and can be borderline game-breaking. Yukari's trait makes her healing magic cost almost nothing. Mitsuru's increases the critical hit rate of your party whenever an enemy has an ailment. Junpei just lands more critical hits and they deal more damage, and Akihiko's is just absurd. While the text might make it seem kind of bad initially, it's actually one of the best ones in the game. Akihiko's personality trait increases the potencies of buffs applied to him. So in a game all about buffing and debuffing, Akihiko's skill just makes buffs objectively better to use on him. It's not a small increase either. Akihiko becomes a monster when fully buffed, and the other members aren't that far behind him thanks to what they bring to the table, whether that be with their revamped skill selection or with one of their game-breaking theurgies. So theurgies are the new flavor of the week. Think of them like limit breaks from Final Fantasy, but a hell of a lot more exploitable. Theurgies come in a few shapes and sizes, though a vast majority of them focus on dealing damage. I can't quite say that I'm too big of a fan of these. Theurgies deal way too much damage and are far too exploitable for their own good. On top of being able to basically one-shot every random encounter, theurgies also pierce through resistances. But the thing is, they still technically count as elemental damage, so you can actually exploit weaknesses off of a theurgy attack. This, combined with not having any cost, makes theurgies a safe option 100% of the time. Don't know what this boss is weak against? No problem. Just pop a theurgy and have it recorded for free, and get in some good damage to boot. You might think it's a waste, but don't worry, theurgies can charge insanely quickly. While a party member will gain a small amount of their theurgy meter whenever they summon a persona, each character also has a special method to make them charge faster. It usually relates to their playstyle. Yukari gains theurgy whenever she heals, Koromaru when he scores a weakness hit, and Mitsuru gains some when she lands an ailment, which I thought was pretty funny. The point is, theurgies are very easy to fill up, and depending on the character, you can get a full gauge in as little as 3 turns, and that's quite frankly insane considering the ridiculous shit you can do with these. Enter a boss fight with a maxed out party and you can effortlessly take it down just by spamming your super attacks. Most Tartarus bosses don't stand a chance against this strategy, but if you're really afraid of dying, put Ken on your team. His first theurgy isn't that great, but his second one is probably the best one in the game. Not only does it fully heal the party, but he also revives any dead members and applies both Tetrakarn and Makarakarn. Combine this with his extremely generous recharge rate, and with Ken in your party, you're not dying anytime soon. Theurgies are meant to be an evolution of Persona 5's Showtime attacks, a mechanic that I'm also not too big of a fan of. While I appreciate the attempt to make it a more controllable and versatile tool, I don't think this type of mechanic meshes well with this game. This is funny to say because the original Persona 3 felt very considered when it came to its core mechanics. Whether you like it or not, the tactics from the PS2 version plays a large part in that game's identity, not just because the gameplay was designed around using the AI, but because the mechanic is used to help express the game's core message. This is something that the director of the original, Katsura Hashino, even mentioned in interviews.
Yes, it would have been wrong. For this game, There are a lot of RPGs out there where you can control every aspect of your party members, including what kind of underwear they're wearing. But because we wanted the player to relate to the hero more than any other character in Persona 3, we wanted the other characters to feel like other people.
Something that the original Persona 3 worked to emphasize was the individuality of the party members. A lot of effort was placed into making the other members of SEES feel like real people, not just video game companions. They had lives outside of the main character, and their character arcs were handled on their own terms. This individualism is reflected in the core combat through the tactics system. Rather than directly controlling your party members, you instead assign the AI roles to follow through the tactics menu. The main goal of this system was to allow the party members to truly shine on their own, while also demonstrating their camaraderie. As their bond grows throughout the story, the characters learn how to work better as a team in the gameplay. The tactics system was vital to demonstrating this idea, and it blows my mind to see the way people talk about this mechanic. Some people act like this mechanic was a genuine mistake, and the mere idea of it was flawed, and that sucks to see. I get that the tactics menu isn't perfect in the original game, but to act like it's completely unusable is just disingenuous.
But you said never to
I know what I said!
Yeah, I like the tactics system in Persona 3 now. I was one of those people that used to really dislike the tactics system. I vividly remember struggling with it a lot on my first playthrough of the game. However, as the years have gone on and I've played through Persona 3 more and more, I've grown to appreciate this unique approach to combat, which is why it sucks to see the tactics system get completely gutted in future games. Persona 4, in response to the feedback from P3, added direct commands while keeping the AI settings as an option. This would have been a nice compromise, but the issue is that the AI is completely unusable now, and we're missing more than half of the tactics. I'm not sure what happened in between games, but Persona 4's AI was a complete downgrade from Persona 3's, and unfortunately, it's been like this ever since. It sucks to see such a novel idea get completely shelved after the first attempt. And while I don't mind that direct commands became the standard, the tactics menu had so much potential. If you were to ask me, Persona 3 Reload should have put in the effort to preserve the tactics system. Regardless as to whether or not you'd use it yourself, the tactics system is a very important part of Persona 3's identity, and it should stand to reason that a remake should preserve that, right? But no, Persona 3 Reload doesn't do that. The tactics menu exists, that's for sure, but the AI isn't anywhere near close to what we had in the original game. Fuck, it's even a downgrade from Persona 5's AI, because at least there the fan of these would baton pass. I guess SEES didn't get the memo since I never saw them use the shift mechanic, which, yeah, is a pretty big problem. And don't even get me started on the types of skills these chuckleheads will use. The AI in Reload is what people think the AI was like back in the PS2 game. All of the nuanced decision making that came with the old system was gutted. There's no way to see the entire turn cycle anymore, just whoever will be acting next. The more situational commands that allowed for creative play were removed, and the skills that the AI prioritized using honestly feel completely random. It's a complete downgrade from what we had before, and it's not at all worth using anymore. Something that I want people to understand is that this isn't a matter of direct control versus AI party members. Quite frankly, I really don't give a shit if direct commands is offered as an option for those who really just want to control their party. However, what I don't get is why people act like it's impossible to have both. Like, it can either be one or the other, apparently, because I've played games that have both. So recently I played through Dragon Quest VIII in my free time, and I had a lot of fun with it. Something that I was surprised to see was that the game featured its own tactics menu on top of having direct party control. So out of curiosity, I ended up playing through nearly the entire game with it, and yeah, it worked great. The AI was able to easily determine what skills need to be used when, and there were even plenty of settings to adjust the AI how I see fit. And unlike Reload, the AI is smart enough to use the game's brand new mechanic. I just don't understand how games that came out nearly 20 years earlier completely mog this one with their AI settings. One of them being the game that they're trying to remake. Fuck, that's brutal. I think that this discussion can easily lead into another topic that I don't really see many people talking about. Persona 3 Reload has this really bad habit where instead of taking an old idea and improving on it, it's instead scrapped in favor for something else completely, no matter how unnecessary it might be. I already mentioned it, but the original Persona 3 was very considered in what mechanics the developers thought were necessary. Individuality was a big aspect of the party members, but the same is also true for the main character. It's up to the player to decide how they want to spend their free time, level up the social links you desire, take on the personas that you want others to see, and of course, pick which weapon you want him to specialize in. In Persona 3 and Persona 3 FES only, the main character is able to wield multiple types of weapons, ranging from swords, bows, axes, spears, and boxing gloves. Basically, anything is on the table except for Koromaru's knives and Aigis' firearms. Unfortunately, in Reload, this feature didn't make the cut, and now the protagonist is stuck to using only one-handed swords. While this might not seem to be that big of a deal if you've only ever played the remake, I'm gonna argue why this is actually a pretty substantial loss. Persona 3 handles the physical element very differently than the later games do. Instead of having one physical element, it's instead divided up into 3 types of physical damage: slash, strike, and pierce. Also, unlike P4 and 5, characters don't have innate access to all types of physical damage without the use of skills. However, since the main character is able to equip every type of weapon, you're able to cover any weak points in your composition. But choosing which weapon you want to use requires more thought than just attack type, since every weapon class varies in damage, accuracy, and stumble rates. Sure, you won't be dealing the most amount of damage with boxing gloves, but you'll be landing your attacks more often than normal. Stumbling isn't a problem with bows, but they have a lower than average accuracy. There's a lot of consideration that needs to go into the type of weapon you equip, and allows for every dungeon pickup to stay fresh and exciting. If I pick up a two-handed sword, I don't have to worry about using Junpei in my party because I can still make use of it myself. Something you also need to consider when picking a weapon is how it handles in the overworld. Every weapon has different attack speed, recovery time, and length. Snipe enemies from afar with a bow, or get up close and personal so you can throw out some lightning quick jabs. Maybe a weapon that's good for combat is a little unruly to use in the overworld. I love using the elemental weapons with the main character, but I'm gonna have to get used to how that class of weapon handles whether I like it or not. As far as I can tell, Persona 3 was the first game in the franchise to have encounters on the overworld instead of traditional random encounters. So it's insane to see how much thought went into this system, and it's an excellent source of constant, meaningful decision making on the player's end. Reload opts to not include this feature in the game, and the dungeon crawling feels a lot more bare as a result. I don't get the same rush I did from finding weapons in chests anymore, since I already know it's going to be a direct upgrade for whatever character it's meant for. I've had people tell me that they don't care that multiple weapon types are gone in Persona 3 Reload, and it's fine for them to have that opinion, but I have to wonder, why do you want a more simplified game if it doesn't result in a better one? However, that's just the tip of the iceberg, because there's a lot more mechanics that Reload either outright removes or makes significantly simpler and lamer. The fatigue system has been completely removed, and in its place are the Twilight Fragments. These are a good idea in theory, but in practice are almost completely pointless. Twilight Fragments are essentially your Dark Hour currency. You can either spend fragments to open up locked chests, or you can use them on the first floor clock to fully restore your party's HP and SP. In theory, Twilight Fragments should offer some interesting decision making, but in practice, the choice just sort of falls flat. You're just showered with Twilight Fragments just for doing a few social links. I always had more than enough Twilight Fragments to get by, even after opening every locked chest I saw. I managed to clear out every block of Tartarus on the first night without even breaking a sweat. The fatigue system in the original game wasn't perfect, but I don't think that it should have been trashed entirely because it was an interesting way of gatekeeping players from rushing through all of the content in one sitting. The reason why Persona 3 doesn't have a whole lot of nighttime activities is because Tartarus is something that's meant to be tackled at your own pace. The fatigue system was interesting because it forced you to properly plan when you wanted to visit Tartarus. Being tired in combat is a massive penalty since you take more damage and deal less damage. If a party member becomes tired in Tartarus, they'll leave for the night when you go back to the first floor. It might not be the best idea to venture out without the usual team, but at the same time, maybe the backup members might be a better option right now. The system was far from perfect, and it's not too hard to think of ways it could be improved. I think adding a way to properly track when a party member is about to become tired would improve the system greatly. However, instead of fleshing out and expanding on the idea, Reload instead gets rid of it for something that isn't that much of an improvement. In some cases, I'd argue that the replacement is a lot worse too. Nearly every mechanic that required some level of forethought or risk from the player has been either dumbed down or has had all of its edges sanded off. Fuka's Oracle skill has been made into a super ultimate move that buffs the whole party and basically trivializes every fight now. In the original game, it was this interesting roulette wheel that could either be helpful or harmful depending on your luck. It was a real last-ditch gamble you only take when you're out of options, and it felt super satisfying when it worked in your favor. Now, all of the negative effects are gone, so Oracle just becomes the instant win button. Get free party-wide buffs at the press of a button. Or how about restoring all of your SP just to kick Twilight Fragments while they're already down? Even Orgia mode suffers from this. What was once a tool always at your disposal is now locked behind theurgy and comes with a high damaging attack, making it sort of overkill. God, fusion spells are way less interesting now. Just like every old mechanic brought back in this game, the fusion spells act as the protagonist's theurgy moves. However, all of the restrictions that made the mechanic interesting are removed. Instead of needing to have the correct personas equipped, fusion spells instead work off of the personas registered in your compendium. Another thing to keep in mind is that since this is a theurgy skill and not a normal attack, fusion spells no longer cost any resources. By lifting the restrictions that used to be in place, fusion spells lose a lot of their appeal. In the original game, fusion spells felt almost otherworldly. Due to the specific conditions that need to be met, these skills truly do feel like a hidden power. This is why most of them don't play by the same rules as regular attacks. Sure, the damage is good, but the main appeal are those bonus effects. Inflict status ailments on the enemy team, fully buff one party member, a spell where you don't even know what's going to happen. Fusion spells in the original game were good, but they were situational and had some pretty strict requirements. You had to equip a persona that might not be all too great anymore. So is the spell worth the potential risk? Persona 3 Reload removes all of that and just lets you pick whatever fusion spells you have unlocked. It gets the job done, I guess, but it sort of removes all of the magic behind the mechanic. Also, not a fan of how most of these spells are just the same thing but scale up in damage. If they were going to bring back fusion spells like this, they should have brought over the more unique ones instead. We already have a bunch of theurgies that deal damage, so it would work well to spice things up. Do we really need 5 of the 7 fusion spells to be focused on dealing damage? Especially since I'm only going to be picking the one that deals the most amount of damage anyways? It would have been so much better if some of these spells only came with their secondary effects like in the original game. Do I want to deal medium almighty damage to all enemies? Not really. But a spell that has a high chance of knocking down all enemies at the cost of dealing no damage? Sign me up. However, it would be disingenuous for me not to mention that there are 2 fusion spells that take on more supportive roles, and these are easily the most fun ones to use in the game. Cadenza restores a large chunk of HP to the party and applies agility buffs, classic stuff. And Best Friends allows you to put both charge and concentrate on any party member. I'm a much bigger fan of these more situational skills since they prove to be the most balanced. Good in some scenarios, but not good in every scenario. And every fusion spell should have followed this philosophy, at least in regards to keeping it as a theurgy exclusive mechanic. The original game does offer some high damaging attacks through its fusion spells. However, even though they have specific requirements, the skills themselves still behave like every other attack. Elemental affinity was still taken into account. You can't use a fire-based spell like Ardenari on an enemy that blocks said element and still expect results. I get that this sounds like very basic shit, and I would agree, but for some reason, Reload felt the need to change this very deliberate decision. All of the spice is gone, and it's so much more lame now. The common trope I notice with all the changes Reload makes to the combat is that it's done to simplify the game rather than to be a legitimate improvement. The way this is accomplished is by minimizing the risks but maximizing the reward. Every mechanic that featured any potential risk on the player's end has been sanded off to the point where it may as well just be a new mechanic entirely. I mean, if you squint your eyes hard enough, it's kind of like the old game, but without all the stuff that made it cool or interesting to begin with. I already know that a lot of people are rolling their eyes at what I'm saying, so I should make it clear that I have nothing against a remake updating old mechanics, or hell, even adding brand new ones. However, if you're going to start making changes to the foundation, then it needs to be A, an improvement, and B, feel like a natural addition. The Resident Evil 4 remake is a good example of this. The core gameplay experience makes conscious efforts to preserve what people enjoyed about the original game, but also changes aspects of the game when appropriate. There are now these optional encounters you can do for a payout. Weapon switching can be done outside of the pause menu, and the game even now has this sick-ass parry that feels right at home with RE4's design. The big difference between these two games is that RE4 Remake, despite its additions, sticks with the same core values of the original game. Persona 3 Reload doesn't do that, and instead opts to throw out what the original title was going for and adapts what's currently the status quo. Now, I wasn't expecting for a second that everything from the original Persona 3 was going to make the cut. However, everything that I just mentioned, no matter how big or small it might seem, does play a substantial part in defining what Persona 3 was in a gameplay sense. With all of these quirks excluded, we're left with a combat system that feels like Persona 5 with a Persona 3 skin, which isn't the worst fate, I suppose. But for what's supposed to be a faithful remake, this is probably the safest route they could have chosen. And this is supposed to be a faithful remake. I remember reading some interviews a while back, picking some of the staff's brain about what kind of remake this was gonna be, mainly the one conducted by 4Gamer. This was all the way back in June of last year, so we didn't know too much about the game at the time. While most of the contents of this interview are irrelevant now since we have the game in our hands, it still serves as a good method to understand their mindset while working on this project. There's a lot of interesting stuff to find here, but what stood out to me was this quote by Reload producer Ryota Nitsuma in reference to the original game.
Even after becoming a developer, I felt that P3's appeal was in its rough edges. While that roughness needs to be polished in order to create a game that people will want to play now, those rougher edges are important to the essence of the game, so it's important that they not become too rounded.
You see, what's funny is that I actually agree with what's being said here. As I've demonstrated, it's because Persona 3 has those blemishes that the game manages to still retain a unique sense of identity all these years later. Sure, the execution of those concepts might not have been perfect, but it's undeniable that they are important in making this game what it is. This is something that Atlus themselves even acknowledge, but I have to wonder what exactly they perceive as necessities for the Persona 3 experience. Going through these interviews some more, I noticed that they rarely mention anything about the game's combat outside of the two new features. Just compare the interviews done with the staff of the original game to the ones done for Reload, and you'll notice a big difference in philosophy. In interviews with Katsura Hashino, he talks about the way gameplay is used to convey certain messages and ideas. You know, using the medium's biggest strength to enhance the experience and provide something you can't get anywhere else. It's the exact opposite attitude that the Reload team seems to have. Reading through these interviews give off the impression that the team behind this remake sees the dungeon crawling portion as lesser compared to the other states of play. That's probably why the core combat takes a lot from Persona 5. It's the most popular game in the series, so obviously some notes are going to be exchanged. I wouldn't be surprised if there were some meetings behind the scene where a certain level of homogeny was mandated so the game would appeal to newer fans. I like Persona 5. It brought a lot of really good and fresh ideas to the table. However, I disagree with the approach of just lifting P5's core systems, dropping them into another game, and just calling it a day. It's the safest and blandest way to bring this classic title to a modern generation, and to some people, that's more than enough. But if you were to ask me, this was a huge missed opportunity. Whew, okay, that was pretty long now, wasn't it? So the game's a bit different now, whatever. I understand that the majority of people probably won't care about any of this. To that crowd, all that matters is whether or not the changes that Reload brings makes the gameplay better. Yeah, the game plays just fine, and I'll at least compliment it for attempting to add new features. Even so, just because one game has more mechanics than another, it doesn't guarantee that those systems have any meaningful depth. Mechanics on their own don't mean a whole lot when the design surrounding them isn't up to snuff. A good example of this is with the Devil May Cry games. The original DMC is comparatively simpler to something like the 2013 reboot. In the original game, Dante had access to only 2 main weapons, some skills, and a handful of firearms. Meanwhile, Dante over here has 5 main weapons that can be seamlessly woven into combos. He's got more unlockable skills than ever, and there's even this hook that either lets you pull enemies towards you, or you can pull yourself towards them. Damn, that sounds like a lot, huh? While technically Dante is more capable in the reboot than he was in the original game, the devil is in the details. DMC 1 is a simple game to pick up, but the depth lies in how the game's core mechanics are meshed with the enemy design. It really feels like the game takes full advantage of the toolkit the player has access to, with little tricks hidden all over the game for more seasoned players to give themselves an edge on repeat runs. The reboot gives the player more options in combat, but it ends up not really mattering all too much when every enemy can be taken down in the exact same fashion. There's little to no reason to experiment or try out your new toys outside of intrinsic motivation, or in the cases when you're outright forced to play a certain way. I bring all of this up because I feel as though this exact same conversation can be had about P3R's approach to its gameplay compared to the original. One game has more mechanics, yes, but the design surrounding them isn't up to snuff, which means it's time for everyone's favorite topic, difficulty. Persona 3 Reload is one of the easiest games in the franchise. I'm talking Persona 5 Royal and Innocent Sin levels of brain dead. To give a little context, I played the game on Merciless mode, which at the time of writing is the highest difficulty available. To give credit where it's due, Atlus did listen to feedback from Royal. In that game, Merciless mode had a lot of hidden gimmicks that swayed the balance heavily in the player's favor. It was to the point where you were better off playing on hard mode than Merciless mode. It's good to see them walk back on this idea, because now people might actually pick this difficulty difficulty level. That's what we call a step in the right direction. Too bad the game is still free as shit. So recently, there's been some revisionist history when it comes to the Persona games. Apparently, all of them have always been baby easy, so there's no point in even trying to have a discussion about this. Now, I don't know about you guys, but as someone who's been in these trenches for about a decade now, Jesus Christ, it's been 10 years. As someone who's been playing these games for a little bit now, I've gotten to witness firsthand how people's perception towards this franchise has shifted over the years. I remember for the longest time, people considered Megami Tensei to be the big dick JRPGs. They were games that were well known for their high difficulty, and yes, this even includes the Persona games. Most of them. This mentality only started to change around the time when these games started to receive enhanced re-releases. These newer versions of the Persona games tend to make the games easier, whether that be through the introduction of new mechanics or through really poor rebalancing. Since games like Golden and Royal are treated as the standard by the community and Atlus themselves now, it's easy to forget just how brutal some of these games could get. Like, boot up vanilla Persona 4 on expert mode, and you'll be shocked to see how much harder enemies' attacks hit. Funnily enough, the only game to not suffer from this was Persona 3, since hard mode was a FES edition. The point is, these games becoming more and more laid-back experiences is a recent thing. While I was expecting Reload to fall short of FES's hard mode in terms of challenge, what I wasn't expecting was just seeing how bad the balancing really is. And I mean truly bad. And it sucks saying that because the first 2 in-game months were borderline perfect in terms of balance. Enemies required me to think multiple steps ahead, take full advantage of shifting, and even presents opportunities where you might be better off using the extra turn for something else other than an all-out attack. The bosses were also pretty tricky too, partially due to limited resources at the start of the game, but even when Akihiko joins the party, the game manages to stay fairly challenging. The boss fight against the Clairvoyant Relic was really fun. It's probably my favorite Guardian fight in the game. It's one of the only times where guarding is actually encouraged to be used outside of scripted attacks. Hell, I even ran out of time fighting the Priestess Shadow. That has never happened to me before. I'll admit, I was having a really good time during those first few months, partially because of the shiny new game smell, but also because everything just felt right during that period. But then, something horrible happens. What the fuck are you guys wearing? Not too long after Fuka joins the team, the real game breakers start to unlock. Of course, there's the personality traits, but this is also when you get the theurgy attacks. As I mentioned earlier, these are hilariously exploitable. Boss fights that would have been otherwise interesting end up being trivialized thanks to these. The protagonist's fusion spells are especially guilty of this, since each one scales in power exponentially. Once you unlock Scarlet Havoc, that's it. The game's over. Just pack it up. Even if you don't end up using theurgies to cheese the game, the boss fights in the latter half of the game drop off pretty hard in quality. The Tartarus Guardians in the original game weren't perfect either. Sometimes you'd get fights that were genuine tests of challenge, and other times you'll get a fight that lasts all of one turn before you move on with your life. Even with all of those lesser encounters included, the overwhelming majority of the Guardians are well designed. Some even test you in unconventional ways. You'll go from groups of enemies that all share a weakness, to one massive enemy that's a bit more tricky to take down. It gets even more creative the further you ascend Tartarus 2. There's a boss where weakness exploits deal little to no damage, forcing you to learn how to keep enemies in check through knockdowns. Eventually, weaknesses are dropped entirely, and you have to deal with whatever gimmick the boss has at their disposal, with no crutch to fall back on. The hard mode version of some of these bosses aren't afraid to clap you until you realize you gotta come in prepared. I love the way the original Tartarus constantly tries to push you beyond your comfort zone, featuring bosses that have access to skills way above your level, so you're forced to build a proper team. While some might call it a difficulty spike, I just view it as the way Persona 3 escalates the challenge. Let's put it this way, none of these fights, even on hard mode, should ever be considered unfair. Before Reload came out, part of me was hoping that some of the more infamous boss battles would make an appearance with their difficulty still intact. Maybe with some nasty surprises thrown in to keep veterans on their toes. While some old bosses do make an appearance, or at least close enough stand-ins do, they're significantly nerfed. Whether that be because of added weaknesses or a worse skill selection. Sometimes both. I think the most disappointing boss for me has gotta be Reload's take on the sleeping table. This guy was a menace back in the PS2 game. Powerful fire magic, light-based instant kill attacks, a deadly ailment combo, and an unblockable heavy damaging almighty attack. This is probably the most infamous fight in the game due to its brutal difficulty spike, and for being Persona 3's real filter. I love this fight, even though I usually get stuck on it for a bit, and I was really looking forward to seeing how it was going to be adapted in Reload. Damn, what is this, the fucking kiddie table? Why is he so small? So, the terminal table. He only has one attack that can be easily nullified, and I managed to kill him in one blow with Shinji's Theurgy. Awesome. It's worth noting that Reload does have optional boss fights that are more challenging than the main Tartarus Guardians. Monad has been transformed from an endgame grinding dungeon to a side area hidden within Tartarus. As I said, it mostly serves as a hosting ground for these bonus fights, and they're alright. A lot more similar in design to the bosses in The Answer than the original game. Not that this is a bad thing, mind you, because I actually enjoy the more puzzle-like approach to The Answer's boss design. However, it's difficult to appreciate the callback when we're shackled with Reload's terrible balancing. I could imagine some of these fights being a whole lot of fun under the right circumstances, and sometimes that shows. But the thing is, after a certain point, the damage output on the player's end becomes so ridiculous that you'll be lucky to actually experience some of the late game bosses. Whenever a game is too easy, something that I hear a lot of people say is to impose self-inflicted challenges, mainly through restrictions. I'm a pretty big fan of challenge runs. I've even done a couple of them on this channel. But the thing is, you shouldn't have to make up some scuffed rule set just to fix poor balancing. If you don't like it, don't use it, works well in theory, but why should I have to accommodate for poor design? It sort of takes the wind out of the sails when the new features added to combat are best ignored if you want a better experience. The original game might give the player less to work with, but at the very least, you're encouraged to make the most out of what you have. And even so, the game still provides a modicum of resistance. If you decide to take the same approach in Reload, then watch in awe at the kind of shit you can pull off. I already talked about personality traits and Theurgies, and while they are insanely powerful, the main source of poor balancing comes from just how easy it is to build busted-ass personas, and skill cards are almost entirely at fault for this. Over the years, I've concluded that skill cards are probably the worst addition that the series has ever had. What started as a novel idea has snowballed into a quick and easy way to bypass inheritance rules and build some truly disgusting personas. Skill cards were first introduced in Persona 3 Portable, and it's safe to say that it's also where the system was best implemented. You had to grind up personas to a very high level to fully take advantage of the system, and even so, you only got one copy of the skill card. While there is a way to duplicate skill cards, it's a lengthy process, and you can only copy one at a time. This helped keep the system in check, even though I don't think they mesh too well with the game's natural design. However, it's in the future games where skill cards start to become problematic. It became too easy to build up a collection of some of the most powerful skills in the game. I don't know about you, but a skill like Debilitate probably shouldn't be something you can just throw on any random persona because you're bored. And Persona 3 Reload brings this full circle. This game just showers you with skill cards of all sorts of variety, but the ones you're really looking for are the passive abilities. It's true that skills like Fire Boost and Apt Pupil are a little rarer than others, but once you snag one of them, you're set for basically the whole game. For some reason or another, the shrine that let you duplicate skill cards was changed in this version of the game. While before, duplicating skill cards took 5 in-game days to complete, now the process is instant. Sure, you can only duplicate one skill card per day, but there's nothing stopping you from duplicating the same card over and over. Never before has it been this easy to optimize personas to deal ridiculous amounts of damage. And don't even get me started on some of the new skills added to this game, because Jesus Christ. Physical fans are eating very well this time around, because it is by far the best method of dealing damage. On top of physical boost and amp skills being introduced, there are also critical hit rate boost and amp skills. This is on top of the already included Apt Pupil, by the way. Combine this with equipment to boost your crit rate even further, and you'll be landing critical hits more often than not, and dealing insane amounts of damage while you're at it. And if there's any enemy that nulls Fizz, then just use Scarlet Havoc. This might just be the most powerful skill in the entire franchise. For crying out loud, you can deal more damage than Armageddon, the skill that's meant to kill everything in one hit. Physical had the potential to be pretty good in the original game, but it was never to this extent. This might just be the best physical has ever been, in fact. There was a reason why boost and amp skills were limited to just magic before this. My mindset when it comes to difficulty is that I don't mind if a game is easy as long as it's fun to play. Even so, there is a limit to this. When a task is so effortless that you can accomplish your goal without much thought, the repetition of it all becomes much more noticeable, and unfortunately, this also bleeds over to the Tartarus exploration itself. Tartarus in the original game is rather infamous for being a bit dull, and I do understand where people are coming from and why some just don't like it. It works well as a cost-saving measure since the dungeon design is non-existent, and there isn't much else to do other than fight shadows. For a remake that attempts to address complaints fans had of the original, I'm surprised to see that there aren't many new additions or changes made. In fact, I'm going to drop a little bit of a hot take here and say that the original Tartarus was a lot more fun to explore. That might sound a little bit weird, but hear me out for a second. The dynamic between enemy and player in the original game was a lot more engaging. The original Tartarus was filled with tight corridors and choke points, and it was a little tricky to sneak by shadows because of it. More often than not, choosing to avoid a shadow entirely came with a bit of a risk, since they would attempt to hunt you down for a certain distance. But the really cool part about this is that if you were forced to retrace your steps for whatever reason, the behavior of that enemy would completely change. The shadow would enter this alert phase where it would act as a wall and try to cut you off. Still possible to avoid, but much trickier. Play too recklessly and you'll find yourself cornered with no other way out than to fight. And as I said, the different weapon types allowed you to alter your approach options to fit your playstyle. Yeah, the old version of Tartarus wasn't perfect, but the design was very considered. Tartarus in Reload removes that entire dynamic. Not only are you stuck to using one-handed swords, but the alert phase that I mentioned was also removed. Now shadows vanish after chasing you for a set distance, and if you were to go back, it's like you were never there to begin with. What, did you get bored or something? But what truly neuters all potential challenges in the exploration is the sprint button. I don't mind this in principle. The floors are bigger now, so it only makes sense to have it, right? Sure, it's a little easy to run past some encounters now, but it's not anything I'm losing sleep over. What's perplexing though is that this sprint can be upgraded to guarantee yourself player advantages when striking an enemy. It doesn't matter what angle you approach the shadow, you'll still get the advantage. Literally the exact opposite of the old game. It creates this weird scenario where you're honestly better off charging in head first rather than surveying the area to pick the best option. The last thing I should be doing when the Reaper shows up is slamming into him with the speed and force of a bullet train. Man, what happened to the Reaper? Used to be scared shitless whenever I saw this guy. Now you can just casually walk circles around him, like he's not even there. And I think this is probably where we should call it on the gameplay. Trust me, there is a lot more that I could say, but I think I've gotten the point across, and going into any further detail would just be really nitpicky. Yeah, I'm not exactly the biggest fan of the direction they took with the dungeon crawling. I know that I've been pretty negative throughout this section, but that's because a lot of the nice things I have to say about Reload's gameplay is very basic shit. Yeah, manual skill inheritance is good, and the more varied Tartarus generation is nice, but it's not something that I think is worthy of praise since it's to be expected. Even if I were to acknowledge those points in this video, we're still looking at a net negative here. The aspects of Reload's game design that I don't like are just too severe to be ignored. Maybe there's one or two good changes in there, but the fact is, the majority of it isn't to my liking. It's difficult for me to judge Reload on its own merits when I've already got a reference point as to how Persona 3 combat can be handled. I believe the only way to truly evaluate a remake on its own is if you haven't experienced any aspect of the original game, since even that slight exposure will set expectations. I don't find it to be unfair to compare Reload to the original, since, well, it's a remake. Persona 3 Reload wants to recapture the experience provided by that classic title. It's the criteria the devs behind the project were following, and if you were to ask me, I think they failed to accomplish that mission statement. This entire situation just gives me flashbacks to the 2016 Ratchet & Clank reboot. Another remake of one of my favorite games that failed to deliver on what it set out to accomplish from a gameplay perspective. In Ratchet's case, the remake took what was a pretty novel concept for a 3D platformer and turned it into a standard third-person shooter with some jumping and fun weapons. The quirks that defined the original title were morphed and changed to the point where the game was almost unrecognizable. Sure, the gameplay is a little bit smoother now since it adapts a more modern playstyle, but what this results in is an extremely safe and bland product. There's fun to be had, but it's nothing all too special, and I think they would have been better off sticking closer to the medley of concepts that gave the original game its identity, and the exact same sentiment applies to Persona 3 Reload. Weird this is the second time this has happened to a favorite game of mine, but hey, what do you gotta do? Now, I understand that all I just said might not mean a whole lot to you if you view Persona gameplay as a means to an end. I get that. Back when I first got into this series, I didn't particularly care all too much about this stuff. Sure, I had fun with the combat of a game like Persona 4, but what really drew me in was the social life elements, and I'm sure most people watching probably feel the same. It's only after I really got into analyzing games as experiences rather than as products when this kind of stuff started to matter to me. I'm a huge fan of when video games try to use their mechanics and design to express the main messages of the game. It's why I like titles like The World Ends With You so much. Sure, they might be a little unconventional, and I can even imagine some people outright disliking those weird quirks, but it's impossible to deny that these kinds of games have a hell of a lot of personality and express their core messages in creative ways. This is something that the original Persona 3 accomplishes rather well, but is a bit lacking in the remake. If you had more fun with the direction Reload took with its gameplay systems, then more power to you, but it's not really something that I could get into. The biggest reason why people wanted a Persona 3 remake to begin with was to see that classic title be portrayed through the lenses of modern standards. The presentation received a massive overhaul, and for the most part, I'm a fan of the end results. Tatsumi Port Island has never looked and felt so alive, with every detail being painstakingly recreated. The character models all look great, and the in-battle animations are as polished as ever. What surprised me the most, though, was just how much I enjoyed the voice acting for this game. Back when Reload was first announced, there was a bit of friction when it was revealed that the entire English voice cast was going to be replaced. It was a little disappointing to hear at first, especially since the Japanese cast remained the same. However, it doesn't take much thought to come up with a few reasons as to why this was the case. As much as I wanted the old voice actors to return, I was more than willing to give these new guys a shot, and they're pretty good actually. In some cases, I find the new casting to be an improvement. Alejandro Saab's more stoic take on Akihiko allows for the character's more dorky moments to be a stronger whiplash. Oh, but the best recasting is Zeno Robinson as Junpei. He manages to perfectly capture the energy and attitude you'd expect from the character. But when the time comes for Junpei's more sensitive side to be put on display, he pours his heart out. And of course, shitpost legend Alex Lee has taken the mantle as the protagonist.
Hey there, everybody. This is Luke from Streets.
Not sure if this is a hot take to say, but I believe this is a perfect recasting, and I would love to hear these new voice actors return in future games. Something really cool is that a handful of the original cast does return to voice some of the adult characters. I'm not sure if this was intentional or not, but it comes off as the old voice actors passing the torch to the new generation. One last hurrah with Persona 3 before their time in the spotlight comes to an end. My only minor complaint, though, is that Grant George is terribly miscast. In the PS2 game, he voices Shinjiro Aragaki alongside Officer Kurosawa, but in Reload, he now voices Mitsuru's father, with Kurosawa now being voiced by Liam O'Brien. Like, come on, it was right there. But other than that critical failure, it's a pretty cool sentiment. The voice acting compliments don't stop here either. For the first time in the franchise, every single social link rank is fully voiced. This is an awesome addition, and it adds so much life to the game's world, and honestly, helps you appreciate some of these characters more than you otherwise would have. I know I'm not the only one who found Kenji to be a lot more endearing after he got a voice actor. It's a lot easier to understand that Kenji isn't exactly super serious about dating a teacher, and he's just trying to live a childhood fantasy. This is something that you can infer in the original game's dialogue, but having definitive proof of what tone the character is speaking in helps a lot. Quite a few social links became more enjoyable to me thanks to the voice acting. Yuko especially rose on my list because her voice actress did a fantastic job. For the most part, Reload looks and sounds great, but that's not to say it's perfect. One of my big problems with this game's art direction is the color palette and lighting. Persona 3 on PS2 has very moody colors. Sure, blue is the game's main theme, however, most of that exists in the UI and opening movie. The actual environments have a dreary tone. The best example of this is Iwatodai Dorm. The soft lighting and dark colors gives this place an almost uncomfortable feeling at the start of the game. Though, as you familiarize yourself with this place, it ends up becoming very welcoming. You start to associate the dorm with that of a safe haven, a place where you don't have to wear any masks and you can do whatever you want. Though at the end of the game, when the final countdown to Nyx begins, the dorm takes on a whole new feeling. Suddenly, that warm welcome is replaced with a sense of impending dread. Every night you return to the dorms, that knot in your stomach gets a little tighter because day by day, your biggest challenge approaches. In contrast, Iwatodai Dorm in Reload looks like crap. It's mostly the flat lighting to blame. Everything is so perfectly lit that there aren't even shadows being cast by the characters. This just makes them feel like models plopped in a scene rather than people who actually live there. You get used to it eventually, but for such an important location, it really should have looked better. Speaking of which, I'm not exactly the biggest fan of how they approach the dark hour in this game. Everything is just so brightly lit and saturated that it dilutes the oppressive atmosphere. And don't even get me started on just how green everything is. This game takes the Nocturne HD approach when it comes to its lighting and makes the Dark Hour overwhelmingly green. Yeah, it's green in the original game too, but the difference is that it was subtle, a nice tint to help distinguish our own reality from this otherworldly take on the contemporary. Now everything is so fucking green you'd swear this is Persona 6. Dare I say that the lighting sometimes ruins the mood on occasion. One of my favorite visuals in the game was the final boss arena. This shit was legendary in the original. This godly being towers over the player with the moon illuminating it from behind. Harsh dark clouds swirl over the top of Tartarus. It almost feels like the Dark Hour has finally crossed over into our regular world. The perfect setup for an endgame fight. The final boss in Reload is just green. A lot of the small details that make the original fight feel so alive are missing too. And you know what? This is a constant problem throughout the game. The battle backgrounds in the PS2 version were so good, dude. They were all these psychedelic mindscapes that took elements from the regular environments and twisted them into these extravagant pieces. The full moon shadows had some really standout ones in particular, with my favorite one being the Hermit Shadows arena. It uses the context of a shadow siphoning the city's power to its fullest extent. The room is entangled by thick red and blue cables, with currents of electricity crackling along through them. The dark lighting allows for the Hermit's Gigaspark attack to fully stand out, and the low camera angle gives this beast an imposing form, even though it's one of the easier bosses in the game. The Hermit Arena in Reload is just a green room, with cables so thin that you might not even notice them. The same is true for almost all of the boss arenas. What were once these elaborate set pieces have been sanded off and simplified into these boring, lifeless rooms. The arenas might match the cutscenes now, but goddammit, this is a video game. Where's the spectacle? What happened to the attention to detail? Fuck, even Portable managed to keep all of this stuff in. And that's just sad. But if you want downgrades in the presentation, then look no further than the cutscenes. The standard and engine ones look fine, but again, they lack some of the basic, small details that help them feel alive, and the script isn't doing them any favors either. For some reason or another, Persona 3 Reload bases its script off of the PSP version of the game. If you know anything about Portable, then you know that instead of having fully 3D cutscenes, the game takes on a visual novel presentation. This was necessary to accommodate for the hardware, so to make up for the lack of visuals, extra descriptors and lines were added to the script. It works there because it's literally necessary. But for some reason or another, this was the script adapted for the remake. What ends up happening is that instead of allowing the players to get absorbed into the story and experience the intended emotions themselves, the characters now flat out tell you what's going on and how you should feel about it. Whatever happened to show don't tell? This was something the PS2 game was great at, but Reload dumbs down for whatever reason. This is apparent as early as the very first cutscene in the game. I love the original game's opening because it's a perfect tone setter. It's such a simple scene when you look at it on the outside, but it perfectly sets your expectations for the kind of world you're about to experience. It features Makoto walking through Tatsumi Port Island, blasting his headphones, almost as if he's trying to drown out the rustle and bustle of the city around him. However, at the same time as this, we're intermittently shown flashes of another story taking place. A mysterious girl places what looks to be a firearm to her head. She's trembling, her breath is shaky, and just when you think she's about to go through with it and pull the trigger, she breaks down crying. All of the proper emotions are conveyed without any dialogue, and the quick cuts between the regular everyday and Yukari's desperation builds a lot of suspense and intrigue. The Reload version of this cutscene guts all interesting direction and composition in favor for something way less engaging. The quick cuts are gone, and Yukari now has added dialogue that takes away from the suspense. There's also just a general lack of build-up now. While it's true that both versions of this scene have the exact same thing to say, one clearly does it in a much more engaging way that actually respects the audience. A lot of the cutscenes feel like this, to be honest. Sure, the animation quality is higher and the characters are more consistently on model, but the composition and direction pales in comparison to the original game. The animated cutscenes before were saved for key moments where the in-game models wouldn't do the scene justice. They got creative with the presentation here, and are probably some of the better cutscenes in the series, even if the animation could be stilted. Reload's animated cutscenes feel off, almost as if they were included out of obligation rather than as a creative choice. Some of them didn't even make the cut either, and are now just adapted in engine. The protagonist's awakening is one of the biggest downgrades because of it. What was once one of the most legendary moments in the franchise is now a very flaccid and boring awakening. In the classic game, there was a lot of time spent building up to the moment where Makoto pulls the trigger. The scene goes silent, with nothing but his heartbeat ringing in your ear. It gains intensity, beating faster and faster as he slowly pieces everything together. The fear in his breath alone adds so much intensity to the scene, but when it finally all clicks and he fully understands what's going on, he gives a slight smirk. And then, BAM! The evoker fires off and the music kicks in. It's the perfect introduction to the game's main concepts of having a strong will even the most terrifying of times. The Reload version of this scene ditches all of that, and it's just so much cheaper and lamer by comparison. I don't understand why cutscenes like this and Shinjiro's death don't get fully animated cutscenes, but the fanservice-y swimsuit stuff does. Like, what are they trying to say here? Should seeing Yukari in a bikini have a higher priority than one of the most important cutscenes in the entire game? There's something almost disrespectful about the new cutscenes, as if I'm not trusted as an audience member to understand the emotions I'm supposed to feel. The cutscene when Tartarus goes away in the original was this melancholic victory. Just when the members of SEES thought they lost their leader, he reappears at the entrance. We see the relief on all of their faces, however, Aigis starts crying uncontrollably. Despite her mechanical body, she still has a human soul inside of her. This was all conveyed without any dialogue or music, just powerful visuals. And if that's not confidence, then I don't know what is. Reload feels the need to add a bunch of dialogue and a cheesy reunion scene. Come on guys, people said SEES weren't friends in the original, so we gotta make sure they know that the characters are worried about each other. It's completely unnecessary and takes me out of the experience. Yes, you still are experiencing the Persona 3 narrative, but the storytelling itself is a massive step back. You can have the best ideas in the world, but if you fail to communicate them effectively to your audience, then it's not gonna leave a massive impact on them. This is something that the PS2 game did without breaking a sweat, but something that the remake struggles with often. However, this doesn't mean that the game never finds its groove, because when it does, it results in some of the most impactful Persona 3 content you can find. One of the big selling points for Persona 3 Reload are the linked episodes. In the original game, the player could only form social links with the female party members. I'll fully admit that this was a bit of an odd choice, but when you play the game, you don't end up missing it all too much. But at the same time, I don't think anyone would pass on the opportunity to learn more about these characters. Persona 3 Portable was the first time players were given the chance to forge bonds with the male cast, though it was locked behind the FemC route. I'm a bit mixed on these social links. On one hand, I appreciate the attempt to broaden our view of the main cast and show us sides of these characters that we normally wouldn't get to see. There's some pretty standout moments buried in here, but at the same time, there are some strange decisions that I'd rather go without. And that's where I'm stopping this conversation because some of you guys get pretty fucking weird about this. The prospect of something like this returning in Reload was a given. Nevertheless, it was interesting to see how they decided to handle it. Rather than giving us full social links, we instead get a handful of side episodes. They're basically the same, but shorter, always advanced when given the choice, and interestingly enough, are time sensitive. It's nothing to worry about though. As long as you knock them out right away, you'll be good. Before Reload came out, I was extremely worried about these. I haven't exactly made it a secret that I'm not a big fan of the way Atlus characterizes the Persona 3 cast outside of the original game. My biggest fear going into Reload was that it was going to be very obvious that this new content was written by completely different people. I was worried that they'd make the characters too friendly towards each other and go overboard on the fan service. This was something that they were actually cautious about while making Portable. Legendary Atlus staff Azusa Kaido, who directed the FemC route of P3P, had this to say about the subject in an old fanbook interview.
You could say that in previous versions, the player's friends aren't actually all that close to them. I wouldn't say we drastically changed that. I mean, P3's atmosphere fundamentally is one of disconnect of strangers. If we were to toss out that atmosphere and have everyone get along like in P4, we would be telling a completely different story.
Now, Azusa Kaido did not come back to work on the Persona 3 remake. While she is in the credits, that's for her contribution to the original game. Despite her absence, what she says in this interview still rings true to the approach Reload takes with its linked episodes. The linked episodes are some of the better additions to the game, and I wouldn't mind seeing this returning in the future. The 10 rank requirement for social links restricts the amount of stories that can be told. An issue that the Persona games are sometimes guilty of is stretching what should be a short story to its absolute limits just to hit that 10 rank requirement. requirement. More than once have I felt as though social links have included some form of padding just to meet their criteria. By halving the amount of ranks, we can only focus on the good stuff. What's interesting about the linked episodes though is that they actually tie into events that happen in the main story. Some more than others, but it allows the new ranks unlocked to feel special when you know you're getting a party member's raw thoughts on the events that have been going down. But I wouldn't get too excited if I were you. These aren't the most substantial additions to the game, and one could argue that the FemC social links offer a more complete experience on the whole. I feel as though Reload does an alright job with the hand it's dealt with though. If you're a fan of these characters, you're bound to find some moments that will resonate with you, whether that be because it gives further clarification on a specific aspect of that character, or because it works well as a piece of foreshadowing for the main story. Ryoji's linked episode does a great job at this. It takes what's otherwise a lackluster character and gives the player much more meat to chew on. The overall quality of the link depends heavily on the characterization. Akihiko is a character that suffers from this. We've gone from protein jokes to always talking about training. I swear, I don't think there's a single new cutscene featuring this character that doesn't mention this at least once. I understand that his obsession with power is the driving force behind his character in the main story, but we don't need constant reminders of that, you know? I'd prefer a much more subtle approach if possible, but that doesn't seem to be this game's strong suit. Junpei's linked episode is one that I feel a bit mixed on. On one hand, it's interesting that it puts an emphasis on his relationship with Chidori, but on the other, it almost spells out all of the nuances of his character in the main story. It directly addresses his jealousy and how it's a symptom of his lack of purpose in life. Just like with Akihiko, we don't need reminders of this. It comes off more so as a lack of faith in the audience rather than a natural inclusion if you were to ask me. As if we couldn't be trusted to put two and two together ourselves and we just had to have it further hammered in. I've been talking a lot about how this game lacks subtlety, but to be fair, a lack of subtlety can be effective sometimes. Like with Ken for example. One of his early linked episode ranks heavily hints at what he's going to do after the events of October 4th. I feel like you can only fully appreciate this scene if you've experienced Persona 3 in some form or fashion before this. It's an emotional gut punch that reminds you that he's just a kid, but at the same time, I feel as though it's a little too on the nose. Like, Ken's dark thoughts are meant to be a twist to the player revealed on the day he planned on carrying them out. It shocks the player because up until then, you never thought a kid would ever reach the bottom of that abyss. For first-time players, this cutscene might just be the game playing its hand a little too early. Though, as someone deeply familiar with this story, I appreciate this as an addition. It just goes to show how serious he was about his plan, which speaks volumes of his mental state at the time. On the whole, linked episodes do offer something for returning fans to sink their teeth into, even if the quality is sometimes mixed. Though if you were to ask me, the best linked episode in the entire game is Shinji's. Shinjiro Aragaki is the best part about Persona 3 Reload. It's the only time in the game where I feel as though every aspect clicks together and creates something that truly lives up to the spirit of the original game, while also surpassing it in quality. Shinji is a temporary party member. He's a man of few words and keeps mostly to himself, rejoining C's on a mission of atonement more than anything. Though his life is tragically cut short, and he acts as a metaphor for the fragility of life. Not everyone will get a happy ending. Sometimes business will go unresolved. So it's best to make the most out of your life while you still can. Treasure those small moments, because you'll never know when it'll come to an end. In the original game, there wasn't a whole lot to work with. You got a good sense of his personality and his moral compass, but beyond that, there isn't much done with him. Shinji wasn't the most fleshed out character in the world, but he didn't need to be for his role in the story. Reload does a lot to improve Shinji's characterization, not just by giving him more to work with because of his dorm activity in linked episodes, but by also vastly improving his role in combat. The glow up Shinji got is insane. He went from being pretty mediocre to one of the best party members in the entire game. In fact, he might even be the best depending on your priorities. His skill selection was vastly improved from the original, he hits like a truck thanks to Bloody Charge, and he straight up just got the best personality trait in the game, and the amount of damage you can deal with his theurgy is just absurd. So even if you hated his character for some reason, losing access to his kit and affinities for combat is a noticeable blow. You immediately start missing Shinji once he's gone, and that's something I could never say about him in the PS2 version. His actual linked episode 2 is also very well handled. It focuses on the relationship he has with Akihiko and Mitsuru. The former was something we already got plenty of, but the latter was always neglected by comparison. By focusing our attention on Shinji's relationship with Mitsuru, we're able to get a much better picture of what the original trio was like. We're even given some literal glimpses to the past. This is fan service done right, since it's additive and provides more nuance to the character that we otherwise wouldn't have. It's impossible to talk about this Link episode without mentioning its ending. If you made it this far in, I doubt you mind spoilers. Throughout the Link, Mitsuru has been trying to convince Shinji to re-enroll in Gekkoukan High. This is something that he's vehemently against. At every turn, he tries to weasel his way out of it, even going as far as to ask the protagonist to return the registration form to Mitsuru. Though with enough pressure, you can convince Shinji to hold on to it, even though he has no intentions of going back. At least, that's what he says. In reality, it was a different story. After his death, you're able to go into his room and find the registration form, only this time, it's filled out. It turns out that before his death, Shinji had a change of heart and planned on getting his life back in order. However, the day before he handed the form in, he tragically passed away. I'll be honest, this hit me pretty hard, and it was from the last character I was expecting to. This is the only time where I felt as though Reload was firing on all cylinders. The gameplay and story were intersecting with each other to create a unique experience that you couldn't get anywhere else in this series. But the thing is, this is the exception to the rule rather than the status quo. If the entirety of Reload was like this, if the game put in the effort to expand on ideas from the original title, while also having the game design and mechanics to express those messages, then I have no doubt in my mind that this would have been a great remake. But with the way things are now, we just occasionally get splashes of creativity in a sea of mediocrity. And if that isn't tragic, then I don't know what is. So, Persona 3 Reload was a massive success both critically and financially. It's easily the most popular version of the game to be released, and will most likely be the status quo going forward. To some people, that might be great news, but I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it. Like, where exactly does this franchise go from here? My only guess is the big number 6, which has been in development for years at this point. But I can only assume that the massive success of Reload is going to influence how Atlus approaches their titles going forward. Would I like to see Reload's mechanics and design brought back in future games? I don't know, maybe. But I'd rather see each entry have unique qualities and ideas of their own instead of being forced to follow some one-size-fits-all formula for the sake of pandering and catering to a wider audience. In Reload's case, it took sacrificing nearly every unique and interesting part of the original Persona 3's style and game design just so it can fit more in line with P5. This results in a mess of a remake that does hit the main beats you would expect, but lacks the creative direction and edge that made the game stand out to begin with. Again, Reload isn't bad, it's just one of the safest and blandest ways they could have interpreted this classic title into the modern era. Persona 3 is more than just its story and characters. Game design, art direction, combat mechanics, all of it played a monumental part in carving out the Persona 3 experience. It all comes back to what I said at the start of this video. Persona 3 is a game of its era, one that was created at a time when Atlus was on the cusp of bankruptcy. When you remove the title from that context and try to fit it in with their most popular game, that's how we end up here. Yes, there's fun to be had with Reload, but I'd much rather stick with the original title even if it's lacking some of the quality of life features because it's so unapologetically itself. Persona 3 was a game that was willing to take risks and experiment, which is the exact opposite approach that this remake has. And if this is the direction they plan on taking with the series in the future, then I can't exactly say I'm excited. God forbid they remake Persona 1 and 2 next, because I can already imagine how much will get thrown out for the sake of making it digestible to people who wouldn't even play it. Or even worse, they remake Persona 4, a game that I actually really care about. No thanks, I'm good. You know, there was a point in time where I considered Atlus to be one of the greatest developers out there. They were a studio that was willing to push the envelope and create experiences that you couldn't find anywhere else. And Persona 3 was the poster child of this. A unique and unconventional game that had a lot to say, and did so in a way that was groundbreaking at the time. Was it perfect? No, but it wasn't afraid to be itself either. When I think of Persona 3, I think of its unique quirks. I think of the experimental combat that works to demonstrate the game's main themes. I think of the legendary art direction and cutscenes. And yes, I even think of the story and characters as well. It all came together to create something truly special, something that this remake failed to recapture. In the credits, you'll notice a section dedicated to the original team. While a nice gesture, it just further highlights that this isn't the same Atlus anymore. This isn't the same Persona 3 anymore. And to some people, maybe that's what they always wanted, and you know what? That's good for them. But for me, this remake represents everything wrong with modern modern Atlus, and I really wish that wasn't the case. You can always mimic the brushstrokes, but you'll never recapture the soul behind someone else's art.